He should think that, he's a fighter, but I think it's a good bet. The UFC is going to take home the belt.
They called Chuck Liddell the face of UFC violence, the knockout king, the man who could walk into a cage with his hands down and still make world-class fighters panic. But the person Chuck hated more than anyone else was never just another opponent standing across from him under bright lights. Because this rivalry stopped being about fighting a long time ago. In the early 2000s, old-school MMA still felt dangerous. Fighters walked into arenas carrying injuries nobody talked about. Pride fighters were stomping grounded opponents in Japan. UFC champions fought through concussions, broken hands, and torn ligaments because there was no easy money waiting outside the cage. The blood stayed on the canvas long after the crowd went home. And in the middle of that brutal era stood Chuck Liddell with the mohawk, the tattooed skull on his shoulder, and that cold stare that made entire arenas erupt before a punch was even thrown. He knocked people unconscious for a living. But one man turned the hatred into something personal. Not promotion, not hype, real hatred, interviews, betrayal, years of resentment that never disappeared even after the knockouts came. Before we begin the story, we need to understand who Chuck Liddell truly was. Chuck Liddell was born on December 17th, 1969, in Santa Barbara, California. Long before the UFC became a billion-dollar company, before ESPN coverage and celebrity endorsements, Chuck was already becoming something the sport had never truly seen before. A fighter who looked reckless, fought violently, and somehow made chaos feel controlled. He came from a wrestling background at California Polytechnic State University, but it was his kickboxing style that terrified people. Most wrestlers in that era fought cautiously once they entered MMA. Chuck did the opposite. He walked forward with his chin exposed, hands hanging low, baiting opponents into exchanges they almost always lost. His overhand right became one of the deadliest punches of the old UFC era. By the early 2000s, the UFC desperately needed stars. Pride FC in Japan looked bigger, richer, and far more dangerous. Their arenas felt like gladiator pits, soccer kicks, knees to grounded opponents, tournament wars that left fighters barely able to stand, and the UFC needed somebody who could represent America against that brutality. That man became Chuck Liddell. Dana White pushed him as the symbol of the company, the mohawk, the tattoos, the emotionless stare during walkouts. Fans saw him as the real-life version of a Street Fighter character. But behind the knockouts and fame, the damage was already building. Brutal camps at the pit under John Hackleman, constant concussions, heavy drinking after fights, pressure to always deliver violence because fans expected blood every time he stepped into the cage. And worst of all, every rivalry became personal with Chuck. He never separated business from emotion, especially with one man. The violence that made him famous also changed him forever. Number 5, Randy Couture. Before the hatred became personal, before the screaming press conferences and the real bitterness that would later consume his biggest rivalry, there was one man who made Chuck Liddell feel something he rarely admitted publicly: frustration. In the early 2000s, Randy Couture represented everything Chuck hated fighting against: calm pressure, Greco-Roman control, patience. Randy never cared about intimidating crowds or highlight knockouts. While Chuck fought like a man trying to end a war in 30 seconds, Randy fought like a technician slowly dismantling somebody piece by piece. Their first major clash at UFC 43 in 2003 changed Chuck mentally. At that time, many fans believed Chuck was already the most dangerous striker in the sport. The UFC wanted him badly as champion because he looked marketable, violent, and unpredictable. But Randy completely disrupted that image. He clinched him against the fence, controlled positioning, forced ugly exchanges, made Chuck look human, and Chuck hated that feeling. The rematch at UFC 52 in 2005 carried enormous pressure. By then, Chuck had already gone through the Pride experiment and returned to the UFC as a bigger star. The company was rebuilding itself around him. He finally knocked Randy out in the first round and captured the light heavyweight title. The knockout became iconic. But what people forget is how deeply those Couture fights affected Chuck psychologically. Randy exposed the weakness Chuck never wanted to talk about. For years, critics claimed Chuck struggled against elite wrestlers who refused to brawl emotionally. Every time Randy forced him backward or pinned him in clinches, it attacked Chuck's identity as much as his fighting style. Chuck wanted violence. Randy forced discipline. Chuck wanted chaos. Randy slowed everything down until the crowd became restless. In later interviews, Chuck admitted Randy was one of the smartest fighters he ever faced, but beneath the respect was lingering resentment. Randy had embarrassed him during a period when Chuck desperately wanted to become the face of the company. And in the old UFC era, humiliation stayed with fighters much longer than injuries did. Because back then, there were no social media redemption arcs, no carefully managed narratives. When you lost badly in front of that audience, people remembered it for years. And Randy Couture was one of the first men who forced Chuck Liddell to realize that fear could exist even inside a legend. Number 4. Quinton Jackson. Long before UFC fans saw Quinton Jackson as a superstar, he was already one of the most feared men inside Pride FC. And for Chuck Liddell, he became something even worse. A nightmare tied to humiliation. In 2003, Chuck entered the Pride Middleweight Grand Prix, carrying the reputation of being the UFC assassin sent to Japan. Dana White openly wanted him to prove the UFC could compete with Pride's monsters. But the atmosphere inside Japanese MMA felt completely different from America at that time. The arenas were silent during fights. No drunken screaming, no constant chants, just cold tension. Fighters entered through smoke while thousands watched in near silence, like they were witnessing executions instead of sporting events. And Pride rules made everything more brutal. Soccer kicks, knees to grounded opponents, endless pressure. Chuck was supposed to represent the UFC. Instead, he ran directly into Rampage Jackson. From the opening seconds, Rampage looked physically stronger. Every time Chuck tried creating space for his punches, Rampage walked through the shots and forced brutal clinches against the ropes. Chuck later admitted the strength difference shocked him. Rampage was not intimidated by the aura at all. He hunted Chuck forward like he already knew the ending. Then came the moment that stayed attached to Chuck for years. In the second round, Rampage lifted him high into the air and slammed him violently onto the canvas before finishing the fight with punches. The Tokyo crowd exploded. For Pride fans, it felt symbolic. Their warrior had crushed the UFC's biggest star, and Chuck took that personally for a very long time. People close to him later described how badly he wanted revenge after that loss, because it was not just a defeat. It was humiliation on an international stage during the height of the UFC versus Pride rivalry. Critics immediately claimed Chuck was overrated outside America. Pride message boards mocked him relentlessly. Japanese fans viewed him as another UFC striker exposed by Pride brutality. The anger followed Chuck for years, until UFC 71 in 2007. By then, the UFC had bought Pride, and the rematch became deeply emotional for Chuck. He knocked Rampage unconscious in the first round, and finally got revenge. But even after the knockout, something about that original loss never completely disappeared. Because old-school fighters remembered humiliation differently. The bruises healed, the crowd moved on, but being physically overpowered in front of the entire MMA world stayed inside Chuck far longer than people realized. Number 3. Keith Jardine. By 2007, Chuck Liddell was no longer just a champion. He had become the UFC itself. His face was everywhere. Commercials, magazine covers, pay-per-view posters. Fans treated him like an untouchable knockout machine who could erase fights with a single right hand. And that is exactly why the loss to Keith Jardine felt so humiliating. Because Jardine was not supposed to be that guy. He did not have the aura of a Pride legend. He was not marketed like Tito Ortiz or Rampage Jackson. He looked awkward, unorthodox, almost messy inside the cage. But sometimes those were the fighters Chuck hated the most. Men who disrupted rhythm instead of playing into violence. Their fight happened at UFC 76 in Anaheim, California. Chuck entered as the massive favorite. Most people expected another knockout. Instead, the entire fight slowly turned uncomfortable. Jardine refused to stand directly in front of Chuck. He attacked from strange angles, used constant movement, threw low kicks repeatedly. Every time Chuck tried planting his feet for power shots, Jardine interrupted the timing. The crowd grew restless because the usual Chuck chaos never arrived. And for the first time in years, people started noticing something dangerous. Chuck looked slower. Not dramatically slower, just enough. Enough for younger fighters to avoid the right hand. Enough for opponents to recover before the counters landed. Enough for fans to realize the old reflexes were fading. And that realization hurt Chuck more than the actual defeat itself. When the judges awarded Jardine the split decision, the arena atmosphere felt strange. It was not shock, like a brutal knockout. It felt like people had quietly witnessed the beginning of the end without wanting to admit it out loud. Chuck later spoke honestly about how frustrating the fight had been. He hated awkward styles, hated fighters who disrupted pace instead of exchanging openly. But beneath the frustration was something darker. Jardine represented the first clear sign that the sport was changing faster than Chuck's body could adapt. Old-school fighters carried enormous damage into their 30s. Endless sparring wars, concussions hidden from commissions, training camps built around survival instead of recovery. And Chuck had already absorbed years of punishment by that point. That is why this loss stayed with him. Because Keith Jardine did not just beat Chuck Liddell. He forced the MMA world to start asking whether the most feared knockout artist of his generation was finally becoming vulnerable. Number 2. Rashad Evans. When Rashad Evans entered the UFC, many older fans did not immediately see him as a future threat to Chuck Liddell. He came from a newer generation, faster, more athletic, smarter defensively. But to Chuck, Rashad eventually became something deeply personal, because Rashad represented the future arriving violently at Chuck's doorstep. Their rivalry intensified throughout 2008. Rashad talked confidently in interviews. He smiled constantly, played mind games. And unlike older rivals who approached Chuck carefully, Rashad showed no fear at all. That alone irritated Chuck. The old-school generation built its reputation through intimidation. Fighters respected Chuck before the cage door even closed. But Rashad belonged to a younger era shaped by television exposure, modern athletic training, and the Ultimate Fighter fame. He did not treat Chuck like an untouchable legend. He treated him like an aging champion standing in the way. By the time they fought at UFC 88 in Atlanta, the tension already felt uncomfortable. Chuck was still enormously popular, but physically the warning signs had started piling up. The wars with Couture, Rampage, endless sparring sessions at the pit, years of knockouts delivered and absorbed. And Rashad saw it. The fight itself lasted less than 2 rounds, but the ending changed Chuck's image forever. Rashad circled patiently, waiting for counters while Chuck hunted aggressively for the knockout. Then came the right hand. Clean, violent, sudden. Chuck collapsed backward, unconscious, before his body even hit the canvas properly. The replay spread everywhere almost instantly. ESPN, highlight packages, sports talk shows. For younger fans, it became one of the most famous knockouts in UFC history. But for people who grew up watching Chuck dominate the old era, the moment felt painful. Because legends were not supposed to fall like that. What angered Chuck most was not only the loss itself. It was how the knockout became symbolic. Media narratives shifted overnight from fear to decline. Suddenly, people were no longer talking about his reign. They were discussing whether he should retire, whether the damage had finally caught him, whether the sport had evolved past him. And deep down, Chuck hated hearing that from fighters of the newer generation. Rashad had not just beaten him physically, he had become the face attached to Chuck's downfall. Every replay reopened the same wound. Every highlight reminded fans that the terrifying knockout artist now looked vulnerable himself. In old-school MMA, fighters accepted pain. They accepted scars. But what they struggled to accept was becoming yesterday's legend while the entire world watched it happen in real time. Number 1. Tito Ortiz. More than any knockout, more than any title fight, more than any loss inside the cage, Tito Ortiz became the one rivalry that genuinely poisoned part of Chuck Liddell's career. Because this was never just business. It started during the early Zuffa years, when the UFC was still struggling financially. Chuck and Tito were connected through California gyms, training circles, and mutual friendships. For a while, people believed they would eventually dominate the sport together. Tito was already becoming one of the company's biggest stars. Loud, arrogant, media-friendly, always performing for cameras. Chuck hated that personality almost immediately. He believed fighters were supposed to prove themselves inside the cage first. Tito understood promotion before most MMA fighters did. Trash talk, press conferences, feuds. He knew controversy created money. And over time, Chuck began viewing him as fake, manufactured, more entertainer than warrior. The real bitterness exploded when Tito repeatedly refused to fight Chuck in the early 2000s. Publicly, Tito claimed they were friends and training partners. Privately, Chuck felt insulted. In his mind, a real fighter never avoided competition because of friendship, especially in an era where everyone fought injured and careers could disappear overnight. That resentment stayed alive for years. Fans often forget how ugly the rivalry became outside the cage. Press conferences turned hostile. Interviews became personal. Tito accused Chuck of jealousy. Chuck accused Tito of cowardice. Dana White quietly fueled the conflict because he understood the feud could help save the UFC financially during its most unstable years. And honestly, he was right. By the time they finally fought at UFC 47 in 2004, the hatred already felt authentic. The arena atmosphere was vicious. Tito walked in acting like the superstar champion. Chuck entered looking emotionless, almost angry at the entire room. Then he destroyed Tito with punches in the second round. But the knockout solved nothing. The rivalry continued for years because neither man truly respected the other afterward. Tito believed Chuck's fame exploded because the UFC machine protected him. Chuck believed Tito spent his entire career hiding behind promotion and excuses. Their rematch at UFC 66 in 2006 became one of the biggest fights in company history. Again, Chuck knocked him out. Again, the anger survived. And that is what made this rivalry different from the others. Chuck respected Randy Couture. He feared Rampage's physicality. He hated what Rashad represented. But Tito Ortiz became personal in a way that never healed, even after the victories, even after the fame, even after both men were already old fighters carrying years of damage. Because sometimes the rivalries old school fighters remember most are not the ones that hurt their bodies. They are the ones that made the hatred feel real. Chuck Liddell won most of the wars people still remember today. He knocked out champions, helped carry the UFC through its most dangerous years, became the symbol of an era where fighters entered cages knowing real damage waited for them on the other side. But old school MMA always took something back. The crowd remembered the knockouts against Tito Ortiz, the revenge against Rampage Jackson, the cold stare during those unforgettable walkouts under bright lights in Las Vegas. What people rarely remember are the scars left behind after the arena emptied, the concussions, the sleepless nights, the years of punishment hidden behind fame. That was the truth about Chuck Liddell. Every rivalry changed him a little more. Randy Couture forced him to confront frustration. Rampage humiliated him in front of the world. Keith Jardine exposed time catching up to him. Rashad Evans became the face of his decline. And Tito Ortiz turned hatred into something deeply personal that lasted far beyond the cage itself. And maybe that is why the old UFC era still feels different today. Those men were not fighting for social media fame. They fought through injuries nobody disclosed publicly, through fear, through exhaustion, through pressure that modern fans barely understand anymore. Chuck survived that era, but survival came with a cost. History remembers the knockouts. It rarely remembers the damage.